Good day, everyone. My name is Anthony Mills. I'm the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute in the United States. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're glad to have you. Global Innovation Institute is the world's leading certification, accreditation, and membership organization in the field of innovation. And we regularly put on webinars like today's webinar as a way of disseminating more information about world-leading practices and innovation, and to keep everyone abreast of the latest trends and things that are happening. So today with us, we have Dr. Larry Schmitt presenting our webinar. Dr. Schmitt is a founder and managing partner of the Inovo Group, a provider of strategic innovation consulting services based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Since co-founding Inovo in 2001, Larry has led their growth to become a successful and recognized leader in the field of innovation. Larry draws upon many years in both large corporations and startups that have wrestled with how to innovate. Larry has worked very closely with Inovo's clients, including companies like Cargill, Dow Chemical, Honeywell, Corning, United Health Group, ExxonMobil, Saint-Gobain, and DuPont, amongst many others, all of whom draw upon the frameworks and methods and tools that he and others at Inovo have developed over the years to improve strategic innovation portfolios and capabilities. Larry regularly writes and speaks on innovation-related topics. Larry holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Wisconsin and a BS from the University of Michigan. Today, Larry will be speaking with us on the topic of purpose-driven innovation. This derives from the chapter of the same name that Larry recently wrote in the book that was recently published by GINI called The Other Side of Growth, an Innovator's Responsibilities in an Emerging World. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Schmitt in presenting purpose-driven innovation. Larry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Appreciate everybody attending this morning. Anthony tells me we have a worldwide audience, which I certainly appreciate. And I really enjoy speaking about this topic. You probably are all aware, especially since you're on this talk, that there's been a lot of discussion lately about how companies and corporations and enterprises need to actually have some purpose-driven mission as well as a profit-driven mission. And so today, what I want to talk about is what is the role of an innovator in helping a company become a purpose-driven organization? How do you achieve balance between purpose and profit? And how innovators can contribute to this and make the world a better place. We mostly deal with large corporations, large multinational corporations who have presence throughout the world. They are very driven by making a profit and having year-to-year growth. But more and more what we're seeing these days is these companies really thinking about and struggling with how do they not just make profits, but actually how do they do good in the world? And as you dive into this subject, you realize it's not that straightforward to think about these things and to figure out what is purpose-driven, what do you have to do, and how do you achieve it? And so I want to talk today about this whole issue from the perspective of the innovator, the person within the company who is creating new things that the enterprise is going to introduce into the world and change the world in some fashion. Let me start by something you probably all know, and that is in 1970, Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago wrote a New York Times op-ed which basically said that the sole purpose of a corporation is to make money, is to have excess profits that they can distribute to their shareholders. And for nearly 50 years, that view of what a company is has held sway and has had very, very profound impact and outcomes on our governments, on society, on the way companies are run on Wall Street. All of those institutions were influenced tremendously by Milton Friedman. Come to 2020, and on the right, you see Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock. BlackRock is the largest investment management company in the world. nearly $9 trillion of funds under management. And in 2020, he wrote a letter to his shareholders saying that a company cannot achieve long-term profits without embracing purpose. And I want to just bookend this 50-year period here with these two very, very distinct interpretations and perspectives on the world at large and the world of business, going from Milton Friedman to Larry Fink. We are now in an age where Larry Fink's thinking that a company needs to have purpose is becoming more and more important. It's holding larger and larger sway within the corporate community. But digging a little deeper, you have to think, what does that mean? What does that mean for the company? I want to take you back to a time in 1987 when this company called Drexel Burnham Lambert invented this thing called a collateralized debt obligation. This truly was an innovation. It was something that was totally new in the marketplace. It satisfied a customer needs, customers who wanted more investment yielding vehicles. It was introduced by Drexel Burnham Lambert, and they made a great deal of money off of it, although they did go bankrupt later on. But Drexel Burnham Lambert was not a company that had any indication of being purpose-driven. It was, after all, the home of Michael Milliken, who got charged for insider trading and the junk bond king. So Drexel Burnham Lambert was purely profit-driven, and they introduced this collateralized debt obligation, and it morphed and evolved over the years. And what happened then 30 years later in 2007, 2008, it was the proximate cause of the greatest recession we've had since the Great Depression back in the 1930s. So these innovations can have tremendous effect on the world. They can actually, cause these types of world-changing events. And one could ask, well, should the people at Drexel Burnham have had the foresight to figure this out? It's difficult to claim that they actually could have done that back in 1987. But what we're going to talk about today is some tools that innovators at these types of companies can use to hopefully map out the future a little bit and see some of these consequences that they're actually, their innovations are going to have in the world. So the key here is, what is the role of the innovator? There was someone at Drexel Burnham Lambert who came up with this initial idea. Okay? And this happens in every company. There are ideas aplenty. We have never worked with a company that has had a paucity of ideas. What companies normally struggle with is how to identify the good ideas, how to move them forward, and how to launch them into the market. And that is the role the innovator plays. They are the people within this company, the person or the team within the company that actually nurtures these ideas along and eventually creates something new that's going to be introduced into the world. And so what role do they play in figuring out what some of the consequences of the things that they're innovating will have in the world, and what are some of the tools that they can use in order to do this? Okay. The first thing you have to do in all this is determine what do you mean by purpose-driven? Okay, what is the purpose of a corporation, and what is being a purpose-driven versus a profit-driven corporation mean? Well, over on the left, you see purpose-driven being one, a purpose of creating economic and societal values, right? Over on the right, you see individual and social values. So this concept of a purpose-driven corporation essentially means that you're going beyond pure economics. Okay, you're going to think about how the things that you do, how the products and services and business models you use in the world are going to affect the world in ways that are beyond the economics, beyond the generation of money and profits. And the question before us is, how do these things get decided? Okay, how do we determine what the purpose a corporation or an enterprise should have? Who is it that gets to decide? How do they decide? how does this get, how do these influences get incorporated into a corporation's thinking, and what the role of the innovator is in shepherding this along this path of purpose-driven. And normally what you see when you read the literature is you see these two poles, all right? The forces of profit on one end, okay? Epitomized by private equity, the people that come in and squeeze corporations for the most money they can get out of the enterprise to feed the investors in the hedge funds and whatever. And then on the other end, the people that are strictly purpose-driven. They say we need to do good in the world. We need to have a more beneficial view of the corporation, and that profits are not the only thing that you can think of or that you should be working toward. And so you see these two poles that are often presented in conflict, one or the other. And what you realize is that they don't have to be in conflict. These two things are part of a complex system that society and governments and businesses are always going through this complex dance and influence with each other, such that they can create things that are good for society, get a return on investment, and are compatible with the government norms and government rules. So you can kind of think of it this way. So business creates something new to the world. They introduce it into the world. Their customers react to that in some way. They adopt it, they start using it. Society reacts to that. People in society see the customers using that. The company starts getting a reputation. That reputation can be good, it can be bad. The company reacts to those reactions and updates or modifies their offerings in the marketplace. If the company does not do that well, then if there's negative reactions and negative reputation, then often government steps in and imposes some sort of rule or regulation or requirement upon the company. And so this is a complex dynamic system that is always in tension, and there's always forces and drivers that determine how a company's offerings, how a company's innovations are received by the world, both for good and for bad. And often what happens is that companies lack the means to predict how their innovations will actually be received in the world. There's this tendency on the part of innovators to only think about the positive, only think about the upsides, only think about how their new innovation can be introduced into the market and grow and be profitable. And some of these other tendencies, some of these other forces that come into being are ignored early on. And one of the contentions we're making is that, number one, they should not be ignored. Number two, they should be actively explored, and they should be made visible so that there can be an upfront reckoning with some of the things that an innovation will have as an effect on the world. Facebook is a typical example. I'm sure all of you have used Facebook and know about the backlash that's happened in many different instances. Facebook has had some incidents in the recent past whereby the negative societal reaction as manifested by media, as manifested by Congresspeople, has started to create this dynamic where it looks like there's going to be regulatory interference in Facebook's business. That there are groups and communities in the world that have gotten so upset that they've actually incited their governments to actually look into how should Facebook be regulated? What can they do to rein in some of the negative externalities of Facebook as they don't do anything about hate groups or other types of misinformation or whatever it is. And so the inaction of Facebook early on and with their communities actually has caused a societal reaction that's been very, very loud and very vociferous, and has happened for years now, which in turn is causing a government feedback to impose some things that Facebook may not like. So you can kind of see, using Facebook as an example, how this whole system works, how some of these things come around to bite the company in the end and cause negative feedbacks and negative things that the company really does not want to have happen. And it looks like it is going to happen. So what is the enterprise perspective? How does the enterprise look on these things? How do they look at the things that they're introducing into the world with a different point of view and a different eye toward not just how much money they can make from them and how widely they'll be adopted, but what is the societal effect? What is the effect on societal well-being? And what is the effect on investors and stakeholders? How are their artifacts introduced into the world, and what impact do they have on the different constituencies that the company interacts with on a normal basis? And the actors in this dance, if you will, in this complex system, are indeed the investors. The investors hold tremendous sway. If you listen to any sort of Wall Street conference with the CEO of a company, all the talk is about what's your next quarter going to be? Are you going to grow your business? Are you going to do this and that? You very rarely hear on these investor calls, very rarely do you hear, it's changing a little bit, but very rarely do you hear, well, what's the purpose? What is the purpose-driven motivation and mission of your company? Okay, how are you making society a better place? You are starting to hear a little bit on these investor calls about climate, about how companies are going to deal with the climate change issue and what effect it's going to have. But primarily those conversations are about what effect it's going to have upon the profits of the company. So you have this whole world that's grown up since Milton Friedman published his article in 1970 that's solely focused on profits, solely focused on the economic equation. But then you have this whole other group of stakeholders, and I have them listed on the right here, the colleagues, the customers, the suppliers, environment, government, communities, that have other interests, that have other motivations besides economic, that the companies are starting to pay more and more attention to. The people that work at the company, the customers of the company, the communities the companies live in. And you're starting to see things like corporate social responsibility, not starting, I mean, this has been going on for a while now, corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line, all of these movements are happening in order to try and influence a company's leadership to look out on the world and have a broader perspective than just economic returns. Now, don't get me wrong, economic returns in a capitalist society will always be the dominant one. So what you see in this often is people talking about how the purpose-driven part of the company, taking care of the other stakeholders besides their investors, actually increases the returns in the company in the long run. And that's the key, in the long run. In the short run, it can be quite painful, and investors tend to be very short-term oriented. But in the long run, the evidence seems to be that paying attention to these other communities, these other stakeholders, actually benefits the economic returns rather than takes away from them. Okay. So you see all of these things, CSG, CSR, ESG, triple bottom line, compassionate capitalism, all of these different movements and ways of measuring and ways of looking at a company are all increasing in influence and getting more and more discussion around them. But the question is, are these things enough? Okay, is being a good corporate citizen, paying attention to the triple bottom line, being environmentally friendly, looking out for climate change, is that enough to be a purpose-driven corporation? So I want to do a couple thought experiments, and these right around not how does the company behave in the world, not how it how good it is in its community, how much it gives to charity, how sustainable it is, its impact on the environment. What I really want to talk about is start thinking about what effects do the innovations that the company introduce into the world have on the world itself. In other words, it's not about the company's behavior, it's about what the company produces and the things that it produces, how they are used and the effects that it has on the world. So let's take a thought experiment of a firearms manufacturer. You have and again, this is very US centric, so I apologize to all of your, all the people in other companies who maybe do not understand the gun culture in the United States. It's very, very different in the rest of the world, but certainly in the United States, there is a large percentage of the population who believes that owning a gun is a social good, all right? They passionately believe that, they will argue for it, they have an effect upon our government. And you start to think about this, and this really confounds our picture about who gets to decide what social well-being is, all right? A major portion of the US population thinks having a gun in every household is a social measure of social well-being, a social good. And the point here is that you can have a gun manufacturer that abides by every single one of those corporate social responsibility, triple bottom line, sustainable, environmental goals. They can give back to their community. They can be great to their employees, and their suppliers. They can be great for the environment and not pollute. They can do all of those things, all right? But are they still can they still be a purpose-driven company? And I don't really care what your perspective on gun ownership is and stuff, but the point of this is that the answer to that is complicated. It really is. And the question of who gets to decide what is purpose-driven is one that gets confounded by the social and government factors to an extent that it's not always obvious. So then you take a step back and say, okay, well, firearms typically, can have a tremendously negative effect on society. All right. They can have positive effects for people that are hunters and like target practice, but they can have a significantly negative effect, as just as obvious with the headlines that are coming out yesterday in the US. So what could a purpose-driven firearms company do? All right, what are some of the things that they actually could develop that would mitigate some of the bad effects and actually make them more purpose-driven? Well, here's some that have been tried and they have not succeeded. If you thought about it, and I bet you could come up with a much longer list, you could imagine a society where the negative effects of gun ownership could be significantly mitigated, and you would have a much more, in my opinion, purpose-driven society, purpose-driven company that would do these things and make a gun ownership something that would not have the negative effects, negative externalities. Let me take another thought example, and that's golden rice. For those of you that don't know golden rice, it's a rice that's been genetically modified to produce vitamin A. And it turns out that the lack of vitamin A in certain Southeast Asian countries, it causes death and blindness in young children because their primary nutrition, and sometimes only nutrition, is rice, and they don't get enough vitamin A. So this simple genetic modification creates this golden rice, and if you just fed children golden rice, they would not have vitamin A deficiency, and they would not die or go blind. And if you look at the effects of this, is that 1 million children a year, okay, go blind or die from vitamin A deficiency. It's a tremendous negative outcome in the world that could be easily solved. But in 15 years, in the 15 years since this has been developed and actually proven that it works, there has been a tremendous amount of pushback from anti-GMO forces, both governmental and NGOs and individuals, that have prevented this from taking place. And you ask yourself, well, saving 1 million children a year versus the GMO, who gets to decide this? Who gets to decide that 1 million children a year are to die because you don't want to have GMO grains provided by some large company, even though the large company is more than willing to give away the seeds to this rice to small farmers, which are typical in Southeast Asia. So you can see the issue of purpose-driven is very complicated in these ways. And who gets to decide, and what the role of society and government are in deciding purpose-driven innovation are things that need to be anticipated by the creators of these types of innovations, so that they can be anticipated and mitigated at the beginning when things are being discussed and introduced, right? So the innovator's dilemma, another innovator's dilemma, I'm a big Clayton Christensen fan, and he wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. This is a different innovator's dilemma, okay? In this one, the nature of this dilemma is that we have an inability to foresee the future consequences of our innovations on the world. We generally tend to only think about the positive things. We generally tend only to think about economic profits and growth. We generally tend to only think about how customers are going to adopt our innovations in the way that we anticipate, and not in ways that we don't anticipate. And so in many ways, the innovator themselves has blinders on in terms of how the future consequences could play out, both for the positive and for the negative. And this is something that we as innovators really need to overcome if we want to lead a purpose-driven effort or mission within the companies we work for, within the enterprises we work for. And part of the problem is that these futures are very difficult to imagine, all right? I'm sorry, they're very difficult to predict. They're not difficult to imagine. And what has happened recently is that through the use of big data, AI, predictive analytics, those types of tools, we've actually come to the conclusion that predicting the future is a data-driven activity. It's a data-driven outcome, and that we can predict futures if only we have enough data and if only we analyze it in the right way. Now, this is true to a certain extent. Certainly, past behavior is predictive of future behavior in many instances, but what we found is that it's only predictive of future up to a certain point. There's this prediction horizon where past which you can't use big data, you can't use analytics, you can't use AIs in order to imagine the futures that may happen. And we call this a prediction horizon. And one of the things that I think innovators need to do and that we advocate for is that they should be the keepers of what happens beyond the prediction horizon, where future consequences must be imagined. They cannot be predicted because you're dealing with complex systems that exhibit nonlinear behavior. The future is fuzzy, it cannot be predicted, but you need to imagine it. You need to actually think about what may happen out in these futures so that you can prepare yourself, but your company, for some of these previously unimagined consequences. The other thing that happens in innovation is that the innovator just typically, within a large enterprise, typically lose control as their innovation advances. The innovation team itself may come up with the idea, or somebody else may have come up with the idea. They look at the technology, they look at the customer needs and desires. They're the ones that build the minimally viable product, or perhaps the proof of concept. They test it in the marketplace. But as the innovation gains steam within an organization, within a company, as the innovation requires more and more engineering time and effort, the number of people involved in this increases. The innovation team itself gradually loses control of the innovation, and it evolves into other people's hands. In some cases, if the innovation is significant enough to become a whole new business itself, then you start literally hiring hundreds or thousands of people to do the marketing, do the sales, interact with the customers, manage the supply chain, do all of those things. So you can imagine going from a team of 10 people, say, in the innovation team, to actually a business that employs thousands of people. The innovator naturally loses control, but it goes beyond that, because the company itself eventually loses control as the innovation is introduced into the world. Of course, they maintain some sort of control because they're the ones that are building and designing the new innovation and introducing it. But it's the customer that ultimately decides what that new innovation, what that artifact gets used for. And the company does not always have control over that in the marketplace. So the loss of the inability to predict the future and the loss of control are the two dilemmas that innovators are dealing with today. Take an example of facial recognition, and this is actually a positive example in some ways, because facial recognition is a technology that has matured tremendously over the past 10 years. You can use facial recognition. Anybody that's gone into Facebook or Google Photos and has seen people identified automatically, the accuracy is just absolutely tremendous. But there are bad actors out there, and suspect actors, who are using facial recognition to create a surveillance society. And there are companies now, IBM being one of them, that have explicitly walked away from facial recognition technology because they have anticipated, the bad uses it could be put to. So this is one case where the future consequences of facial recognition are widely discussed, are widely talked about, and some of the negative externalities, negative consequences have been explicitly imagined so that we can have an upfront discussion about, what are some of the regulations that should be put in place. Same thing's happening for AI. There's many people talking about some of the negative externalities for AI. So what's the solution of this? How can an innovator expand their scope and exert their influence? Expand their scope both within and outside the company, and exert more influence about the nature of the innovation. And the two areas that we focus on are foresight, developing the ability to imagine plausible futures, and strategy, the ability to strategize how things are going to happen in the future and what direction you want to take the company. And what this results in is in innovators expanding spheres of influence and control from just their innovation team out to the organization itself, and then into the wider society and wider community to actually not predict, but to imagine what could happen, and thereby being forewarned, implementing the discussions and the transparency that need to take place in order for an innovation to do good in the world instead of negative. So one of the things that we've been noodling around with is what we call the social model canvas. The social model canvas is an extension of the business model canvas. I won't go into the business model canvas. There's plenty of books written about it and how to develop business models. But the social model canvas actually takes a business model canvas and blows it out so that you can start thinking about your innovation's effect on the world in 4 distinct ways. And these ways are ones that we advocate innovators start thinking about and start adopting the tools and systems and processes, methods necessary in order to think about these 4 different ways. And the 4 different ways, well, just to give an example of the social model canvas could be used to anticipate things like the Uber driver, I won't call it a rebellion, but definitely push back on Uber for the wages and their reclassification as employees rather than contractors, which has major effects on Uber. These are the types of things that the social model canvas is built to anticipate, so that companies like Uber can get out in front of this as they are introducing their new innovation into the world, instead of reacting to it once it happens. So in the social model canvas, the first of the 4 aspects is evolution. So think about how the new innovation you're introducing to the world is going to evolve over the next 10 or 15 years. What is the branching tree of derivative artifacts? How is it going to be changed? How is it, how is the market segmentation going to happen? How is customization going to happen? How are you going to build more and more on top of the innovation? What is it going to look like, as I said, 10 or 15 years from now? These types of efforts to imagine how your innovation is going to evolve can be quite complex and involved. I give some examples on the right there. If you actually look at the tree, the polyethylene evolution tree, you'll see that its introduction as a coating for undersea cables over 30 years has evolved into literally thousands and thousands of different, quote, products, all based on polyethylene, that are used in literally millions and millions of different applications, okay, for different uses and different purposes. And just thinking about that up front opens your mind as to what the possibilities are for these types of new innovations that you're introducing. The next one is alternative use, all right? What are your customers going to use your new innovation for that you had no idea to expect? What are the new circumstances and situations that they're going to take the thing that you're introducing into the world and use it for something other than what you intended? And again, this happens all the time. I give some examples down there, the off-road bikes, kiteboarding, Lego user community, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. They are quite commonly used for things that turn out to be a surprise to the company that actually introduced the new innovation into the world. The third is appropriation. How is your new idea going to be appropriated by others and used in different ways than you intended? How is it going to be copied? Okay, even if you have IP, you can pretty much guarantee that someone out there is going to introduce something very similar, especially if it's phenomenally successful, that's very similar in nature to the thing that you've introduced. So what types of appropriation are going to happen in the future? How is it going to be appropriated by others and used in ways that may not be purpose-driven? And then the final 4th segment of the canvas is, what is the reputation and policy that's going to emerge after you introduce this into a market? How is society going to react to that? How is government going to react to the societal reputation that forms when you introduce these things into the world? These are often long-term things. It often takes a while for the societal reputation to push back on the innovation, and then for government to react to societal reputation. So these are often long cycle, 5-10 year types of feedback loops. But if you don't think about those early on, then you're left reacting to what happens rather than anticipating what happens. And the social model canvas can help you anticipate these things and increase the transparency and have those discussions before they happen. Here's an example of a project we did with a healthcare insurance company. And you can use it as an example. Think when you're talking through this example, think about those 4 things: the evolution of this technology and the products, the adaptation, the appropriation, and the societal reputation. And this is an interesting one because it has a lot of implications that you may not think about right off the bat. So there's technology out there now that claims, and there's evidence to back this up, that just by listening to someone speak, they can tell whether or not you have the early signs of dementia, and just through your speech patterns. They also claim that they are developing means to detect other types of diseases through voice pattern recognition. And this health insurance company realized that it has millions of members calling in every year to their help desk, and they record all these calls. Okay, a member will call in and say, "Does my insurance policy cover this? Am I covered this? What doctor can I go to?" You know, all of these conversations are happening, millions and millions a year. Well, you put these two things together, and all of a sudden you have the capability of the health insurance company to proactively detect oncoming dementia, the members even realizing that this is being done for them, to them. So what are the implications of this on those 4 areas of the social model canvas? How could this not only help people, but how could this be abused? How could it be appropriated? What alternative uses? What's going to happen when society learns that the healthcare company is doing this? What's the government response going to be? All of these things help the company think through how they are going to approach and address these types of technologies and provide new services. So here's the thing that we are advocating and think that is a must for innovators in the future. The first one is that innovators must be futurists. They must develop the capability of having foresight, imagination. They must be able to see beyond this prediction horizon and to imagine plausible futures 10, 15 years from now. They can't be satisfied with just using predictive analytics to see 2 or 3 years in the future. They have to look at the 4 sections of the social model canvas and what the future could be like, both positive and negative, and to anticipate that. And to articulate that, and actually to communicate that throughout the organization, so that the organization can modify the innovation or prepare society or prepare government or their customer base for the types of things that could happen with these innovations in the future. And then the next thing is innovators must be strategists. They must strategize how their innovation is going to be used, not just to build economic value, but to push forward social well-being and be purpose-driven. How their innovations can benefit society and benefit not just their customers, but others who would be affected by the innovation as it comes out of the company and gets widely adopted. So being a futurist and being a strategist are the ways that a innovator can ultimately become the arbiter between the capitalist side of the company and the purpose side of the company, between the economic value a company is generating and the societal well-being force that companies and enterprises can become. And this, to me, is actually the future role of the innovator, is to be this arbiter, to be the person who, actually stands athwart these two realms that are often in tension, and has the foresight and the strategy chops to, say, this is the way it could work, and this is the way our purpose-driven enterprise needs to think about things. But admittedly, this is a very complex situation. This is not simple. This is not something that is, going to be a silver bullet or a golden key to any enterprise's purpose-driven mission. But it's a contributor. It's a contributor that an innovator can really pull the lever of and really force their company that they work for and work with to think about and to reveal the things that need to be thought about. And here are some of the things that this innovator, this arbiter of purpose and profits needs to think about and needs to do in terms of modifying their behavior, to think about multiple actors, multiple objectives, expanding your horizon, and be a futurist and strategist. So that's the advocacy, is to be a thought leader for the purpose-driven mission of your enterprise, to be the innovator of the future, and to use some of these tools and methods in order to push the purpose-driven mission of your company forward. And with that, I will open things up to questions and comments and ideas.
Thank you very much, Larry. We do have a few questions in the chat box here if we want to take a look at them. The first one comes from Susan Burrick, and she just says that I'd really like to know if using foresight helped to prepare companies for the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
Any experience with that or thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, you're talking about a black swan event, right? And black swans are of necessity not predictable, right? But they are imaginable, right? And I don't specifically know of any companies that explicitly prepared for COVID-19, but I do know two things. Number one, there were people talking about the possibility and probability of future pandemics and the effects it would have long before COVID-19, all right? Bill Gates being one of those people, right? And the companies that came through the pandemic the best were the ones that were the most prepared and the most resilient to shocks to the system. So it wasn't that they predicted a specific event, it was that they had prepared their company to be resilient in the face of unexpected shocks, okay, unexpected events, right? And as you saw, there's many companies that absolutely thrive, with the pandemic. You see companies like Zoom, you see companies like Teladoc. I mean, these companies were preparing for a different future. They didn't know that this would be the future that would actually propel them, but they actually, did anticipate that the world would be different, 10 years from now, and prepared accordingly.
Now, if you ask Bill Gates, he would say that the pandemic could be predicted. In fact, he did predict it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
and in fact, Nassim Taleb, the gentleman who introduced the concept of black swan, he argued that it's really not a black swan because people had predicted it would happen. It was a question of when it would happen. But
yes,
but what couldn't be what it could be predicted, but what couldn't be predicted was when it would happen. Not so much if it would happen. So yeah, it was certainly foreseeable, but no one had any idea when.
So I actually, a follow-up comment on that, I actually think Facebook could have predicted the reaction to a lot of the things that are getting them in trouble now, if they just sat down and did some of the things that we've talked about.
Yeah, and think about the different scenarios. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Right.
Yeah. So Braden Kelly mentioned that, and I heard this too, that Trek Bicycles over in Wisconsin also did a good job of seeing what potential impact the COVID was going to have and began moving before competitors. In fact, they saw that this was going to actually lead to a ramp up of bicycle sales, and they ramped up their supply chain to prepare for it. And now they're really ahead of the curve on things. So
right.
I think they've been very preemptive and proactive in looking ahead in the future and thinking about what's next for them.
Yeah, that's a good example too as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Pooja asked, to what extent does the innovation of recycling waste help the environment of their countries? If you want to comment on that.
Well, so sustainability and the full circle, life cycle and the circular economy and stuff are things that people are talking about and actually implementing. There's strong movements to that and to the whole issue of sustainability. And the thing that I think he's referring to is the fact that we often just ignore the externalities and we move the problem somewhere else. So one of the things that you need to do as a purpose-driven innovator is actually think globally, okay, and figure out what are the implications, not just for my immediate customer base. I mean, if you saw the universe of societies and governments, that's a global universe, all right? And thinking about that from a holistic standpoint, would require you to think about what I'm introducing now, what effect it will have on other countries, other communities, other societies throughout the world. So I think once you start thinking about that holistically, you can start, at least talking about and hopefully mitigating some of the bad effects that your innovation will have. All right. Certainly, that's something that the plastics companies did not do early on. They did not think at all about. Well, there's some speculation that they did think about it. They just didn't care about it. But
with single-use plastic components.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So there's another question here. Catherine wants to know does this approach work for innovation ecosystems in the same way it works for innovation companies? So when you think about the entire business ecosystem.
Yeah, well, I'll make two comments. One is this certainly takes an ecosystem perspective in terms of seeing your company as part of a more extensive ecosystem and all of the interactions to the other players, not just your customers or your investors, but to, as I said, societies and governments as a whole and things like that. I haven't, really thought through whether or not you could implement this within an ecosystem. The problem of an ecosystem, there are a number of dispersed actors rather than an influential actor within a company that can affect the company's behavior. And I think it could be applied to ecosystems if you could organize ecosystem participants to actually think about these things and have influence, right? So I think the general principles absolutely apply.
Yeah.
Right?
I think the trick, for most organizations is to be very selective in who you choose to be in your ecosystem, and making sure that you're signing on like-minded organizations that share the same purpose and values that you do in building your ecosystem, and not just haphazardly add any organization into your ecosystem who may not be like-minded.
Absolutely. And, that's, being a purpose-driven enterprises implies that your suppliers, your supply chain, those companies are also purpose-driven, right? They're not doing things, that have negative consequences and stuff. So
yeah, certainly you want to be kind of equally yoked, so to speak, in that sense. Some more comments and questions here. Carolina would like to know how to develop a more future-oriented mindset. What can we study? Where can we find more theory about it?
There's actually a ever-increasing body of work of people talking about how to use foresight. That's a methodology we employ, and if you just search foresight, there's several different organizations and institutions that have training material. I think Anthony GINI is coming out with some training.
We'll be coming out with a certification program in strategic foresight.
Right. So what we're finding is that more and more companies are actually getting interested in this because they realize the limitations of the current, near short-term, predictive approach, that it actually does not prepare you for surprises and long-term consequences. We use foresight. I know the University of Houston has a strong foresight group down there led by Andy Hines. And so you can look at some of the things that he's written and some of the practices that he's done. And there's material out there. And it actually suggests starting with, maybe GINI as a resource for looking at that.
You can reach out to me about that. And actually, here's another great question from Sean Kelly that kind of fits with that. I love this question. The question is, how does a company prevent the futurist and foresight thinking preventing paralysis and introducing innovation? So when companies are choosing between innovations to invest in, we may drift to those innovations that are less bold for fear of possible negative outcomes. And I like this question because there's so many different scenarios that could play out in the future, even plausible scenarios, that it's a bit overwhelming. Which way do we go? So yeah, can you speak to that?
Well, in our experience, using this foresight to futuring opens up as many possibilities as it presents problems. Okay, so we've never run into a solution where people have been shy about pursuing something. As a matter of fact, they often find things that they didn't expect when they implement these foresight. But I get the point is that seeing potential negative consequences could be a little bit scary, but it's even scarier for companies to anticipate that they're going to come down on like a ton of bricks if they don't think about this, right? I mean, just look at the situation Facebook's in right now. They're fighting tooth and nail to prevent Congress from, overseeing them. They're having battles with the European Union over these issues and stuff. I mean, if they had anticipated this 10 years ago and started to talk to these governments and organizations, I don't think they would have not gone forward with their innovations and with their social networks and building it out as fast as they can. But I think they would have been a lot more prepared, proactively to address some of the concerns that people have right now. They may even have acknowledged their role as a publishing platform, okay, as a publisher, earlier on, and mitigated some of these things instead of being reactive, right? So
I think, a lot of organizations think, well, this is risky, let's not do that. And, the classic innovator response is it's risky not to do these things, because
right.
You'll become irrelevant and, the world will move on and you won't if you don't do these things. So their bigger risk is often not taking action. But yes, it can be overwhelming to think about the different plausible scenarios and figure out which innovation is most. And that's where you can also do what's called, stress testing different strategies against scenarios and figure out which strategies are the most robust to the greatest number of scenarios. And if we pursue a strategy along that line, it's going to help us deal with more scenarios than
exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of wrapping it up. A lot of thank yous here from this, and we appreciate it. I did want to mention before we sign off to, if you enjoyed this webinar, consider picking up a copy of The Other Side of Growth, An Innovator's Responsibilities in an Emerging World. Because in this book, Larry has written one of the chapters on purpose-driven innovation, and he introduces the social model canvas in his chapter there. So I think you'll enjoy reading that, as well as 8 other authors have contributed to this book, and the book was put out by GInI at the end of 2020. And so you can find it on the GInI website or Amazon.com. Pick up a copy of the book. I think you'll enjoy that. It really fits well with this presentation. So with that, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank you very much, Larry, for your time and your knowledge and wisdom for sharing with us, and thank everyone for their time, and wish everyone a very good day.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone, and be a purpose-driven innovator.
All right, thank you.
Bye now.